The air inside Sterling Enterprises felt different today. Normally, when Emery Walsh arrived at work, she felt a sense of relief. Even though her job as an assistant in the finance department wasn't glamorous, it provided a steady paycheck, a roof over her head, and food for her son, Theo. It was a job she couldn't afford to lose. But today, she felt like she was walking into a storm. Because she had made the worst possible mistake, she had brought her 3-year-old son to work. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't like she had planned to march into one of the most prestigious corporations in New York with a toddler in tow. She had always managed to keep her personal life separate from work, a difficult but necessary balance for a single mother in the corporate world. But when her babysitter canceled last minute, and she had no backup, no family to call, and no savings left to afford emergency daycare, she had no choice. She had to work. If she lost this job, there would be no rent money, no groceries, no way to take care of Theo. So, against every instinct, she had whispered a desperate prayer and bundled Theo into his tiny coat, hoping that by some miracle, she could make it through the day without anyone noticing him. As she stepped into the massive glass skyscraper, Theo clung to her hand, his little fingers wrapped tightly around hers. "Mommy, why are we going to your work?" he asked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. "Because I have to," she murmured, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder while also balancing a folder of reports. "And you're going to be my little ninja, remember?" Theo perked up at that. "Like a super-secret spy?" Emery smiled, but her stomach was a twisting mess of nerves. "Exactly like that. You have to be really quiet, okay? No loud voices, no running, and no talking to anyone." Theo nodded very seriously. "I can do that." But Emery knew she was taking a risk. A huge risk. She glanced at the tall, suited employees walking through the lobby, all focused on their work, their meetings, their deadlines. No one here had messy toddlers with sticky fingers and stuffed animals. No one here missed meetings because they had to rush home for a sick child. Emery had spent the last 3 years fighting tooth and nail to keep this job. She couldn't afford to mess up now. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted Theo in her arms and stepped into the elevator, watching as the doors slid closed, sealing her fate. The 27th floor of Sterling Enterprises was pristine, sleek, and intimidating. The finance department was a quiet, focused space, where the hum of keyboards and the soft clicking of high heels on polished floors were the loudest sounds. Emery rushed to her desk, keeping Theo close. If she was lucky, she could keep him occupied with snacks and coloring pages until her shift was over. Maybe no one would even notice. But of course, luck had never been on her side. "Emery," a sharp voice cut through the air. She winced before turning around. Hannah Pierce. One of the senior assistants. A woman who never missed a detail, and who had a reputation for reporting everything to management. And right now? Hannah was staring at Theo like he was a bomb about to go off. "Is that a child?" she asked, her voice low, but filled with undisguised judgment. Emery's heart plummeted. She forced a tight smile. He's just here for a little while. I didn't have another option this morning. I promise he won't be a distraction." Hannah crossed her arms, arching an eyebrow. "You know the policy. No personal distractions at work. If Mr. Holt sees this..." Emery's stomach turned to ice. "Mr. Holt," she whispered, gripping Theo's hand tighter. "What do you mean?" Hannah let out a slow, knowing sigh. "Rowan Holt is back today." Emery felt her pulse skyrocket. Rowan Holt. CEO of Sterling Enterprises. One of the most powerful men in the country. A businessman so ruthless that he was called the Ice King behind his back. He had been out of the country for over a year, expanding the company's global reach. Most employees had never even seen him in person. And now, today, of all days, was the day he chose to return. Emery felt sick. If Rowan Holt saw Theo, she was done. Her boss might have tolerated her occasional struggles, but Rowan? He would fire her on the spot. She turned to Theo, crouching down. Baby, you need to stay really close to me, okay? You can't run around. Theo nodded seriously, like this was an important mission. Like a spy, he whispered. Emery let out a slow breath. Exactly. She turned back to her desk, trying to steady her nerves. But before she could even sit down, the entire office went silent. Like someone had sucked the air out of the room. And then she heard him. A deep, smooth voice. Commanding. Cold. Unmistakable. Report, Rowan Holt said. Emery turned slowly. And there he was. Rowan Holt, in the flesh. He was taller than she imagined, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His jet-black hair was neatly styled, and his green eyes, sharp, piercing, unreadable, swept over the room like a man who missed nothing. She felt paralyzed. This was the worst possible timing. She needed to stay invisible. She needed Theo to stay hidden. But before she could even react, Theo wiggled out of her grasp. And before she could stop him, he ran straight toward Rowan Holt. Emery's blood turned to ice. The entire office gasped. And then, to her absolute horror, Theo wrapped his tiny arms around Rowan's leg and said, "Daddy." A shockwave of silence spread through the office. Rowan froze. The man who controlled billion-dollar deals without blinking was now standing completely motionless, a 3-year-old boy clinging to him like he belonged there. Emery felt her soul leave her body. This wasn't happening. This could not be happening. But as she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Because Rowan Holt wasn't just shocked. He was looking at Theo with something else. Something like recognition. And that terrified her more than anything else. The office remained silent, a heavy tension filling the air as Emery held Theo tightly against her chest. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might give out. This was not happening. This couldn't be happening. Rowan Holt still hadn't moved. His piercing green eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. He wasn't the type of man to react impulsively, and yet, she could see something shifting behind his gaze, something sharp, calculating, and unreadable. Theo squirmed in her grasp, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Mommy, why are you squeezing me?" Emery loosened her grip slightly but didn't let go. She forced a smile, though she could feel the nervous tremor in her lips. "Because we need to go, baby." She turned toward her desk, determined to grab her things and get out of there before this spiraled further out of control. But before she could take a step, Rowan's voice cut through the air. "Wait." The single word froze her in place. It wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the kind that made people listen, that demanded obedience without question. Emery swallowed hard and turned back, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Holt, I'm really sorry for the misunderstanding. It won't happen again." Rowan's gaze flicked down to Theo before meeting hers again. "Who is his father?" The breath in her lungs turned to ice. The worst question. The one she never wanted to answer. Emery forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "It's complicated." Rowan tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to make her chest tighten. "Try me." She hesitated, feeling every eye in the office on her. This wasn't a conversation she could have here. Not in front of her coworkers, not with Hannah Pierce watching like a hawk, probably already drafting an email to HR. Her voice caught. "I don't think this is the time or place for that discussion." Rowan's expression didn't change. He simply studied her in that unnervingly detached way, his gaze flickering between her and Theo as if he was piecing together a puzzle in real time. Emery had to stop this before it got worse. She squared her shoulders, hoping to regain some control over the situation. "Mr. Holt, I need to get back to work. And I assure you, Theo is just a little boy with a big imagination. He doesn't have a father in his life. He's never met him. There. That should be enough." But Rowan didn't move. He didn't even blink. "So you don't know who the father is?" The question sent a sharp pang of anxiety through her ribs. He wasn't letting this go. She needed to end this. Quickly. "It was a long time ago," she said carefully. "I was young. It was a mistake. I don't even remember his name. It wasn't a lie exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either." Rowan's expression remained unreadable, but the air around him felt charged, like he was holding something back. "You don't remember his name," he repeated slowly, voice deceptively quiet. Emery forced herself to hold her ground, even as her entire body screamed at her to run. "I don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Another beat of silence. The weight of his stare bore down on her like a physical force. And then, something shifted. Rowan's lips pressed into a tight line. His entire posture changed, subtle, but noticeable. He wasn't just thinking anymore. He had made a decision. "Get a DNA test." Emery's breath caught in her throat. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. But the deadly calm in his expression told her she hadn't. The office gasped in unison, and Hannah nearly dropped her coffee mug. Emery felt like she might faint. "What?" she whispered, barely able to get the word out. Rowan didn't waver. "A DNA test. I want the results immediately." Her entire world tilted. "That's insane," she blurted, voice shaking. "You can't just demand something like that." Rowan took a step closer, and every nerve in her body went on high alert. "You work for me," he said, his voice calm but edged with something dangerous. "You just brought a child into my company who looks exactly like me and called me daddy in front of my entire staff. Do you really think I'm going to ignore that?" Emery staggered back, clutching Theo closer. She felt trapped. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent the last 3 years hiding, avoiding questions, making sure no one ever connected the dots. And now? Now it was all falling apart right in front of her. Rowan's gaze flickered between her and Theo once more before he spoke again. "You have 2 choices," he said, his voice sharp, final. "Take the test willingly, or I assume you're hiding something, and you lose your job." Her stomach plummeted. "You can't do that," she whispered. His expression didn't change. "I can do whatever I want, Ms. Walsh." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. If she refused, she would lose everything. But if she agreed? If she agreed, she might learn the truth she had been running from all this time. The truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Emery looked down at Theo, who was staring up at her with absolute trust, his little fingers curled around her sleeve. She inhaled a shaky breath, feeling her world crack apart beneath her feet. "Fine," she whispered. Rowan's eyes darkened. "Good," he said smoothly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Emery standing paralyzed in the middle of the office. By the end of the day, she might know the truth. And if Rowan Holt really was Theo's father, her life would never be the same again. Emery sat in the cold, sterile waiting room of the private medical facility, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She hadn't been able to eat all day, her stomach a twisting mess of nerves. The weight of what was happening pressed down on her, suffocating her as she tried to keep her breathing steady. A DNA test. She never thought it would come to this. She glanced down at Theo, who sat beside her in a tiny blue plastic chair, his little legs swinging back and forth. He was perfectly calm, happily munching on a pack of animal crackers, completely unaware that his entire world, their entire world, was on the verge of changing forever. Emery wished she could be that blissfully unaware. Instead, she was caught in a storm she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. The moment Rowan Holt had demanded the test, she had known there was no way out. He had backed her into a corner, and no matter how much she wanted to run, to fight, to deny the possibility that he could be Theo's father, she had been left with no choice. Rowan wasn't a man who made empty threats. And the look in his eyes when he stared at Theo, the look of a man putting the pieces together too fast for her to stop him, had been enough to send pure panic through her veins. She had agreed. Because what else could she do? But now, as she sat in this waiting room, she was drowning in the terrifying thought that she might actually learn the truth. What if Rowan really was Theo's father? What if that night 3 years ago, the one she had spent so long trying to forget, had led her straight back to the most powerful, ruthless man she had ever met? What if her life was about to change in ways she couldn't control? "Mommy," Theo whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "When can we go home?" Emery swallowed hard, brushing a hand through his messy curls. "Soon, baby," she said, her voice soft but unsteady. "Just a little longer, okay?" Theo nodded, content to return to his crackers, but Emery barely noticed. Because at that moment, the door to the waiting room swung open. And Rowan Holt walked in. His presence sucked the air out of the room. Emery had spent the past year working at Sterling Enterprises, but she had never seen him this close before. Rowan Holt wasn't just wealthy. He was power itself. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, his broad shoulders tense, his chiseled jaw set in determination, he moved through the room with the confidence of a man who had never had a single thing denied to him. His sharp green eyes landed on Emery instantly. And then, slowly, they flicked down to Theo. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way his eyes lingered, something unsettlingly intense. Theo looked up, blinking curiously. "Hi, Mr. Holt." Rowan's mouth parted slightly, like he hadn't expected Theo to acknowledge him so easily. For a brief second, Emery thought she saw something flicker in his gaze. Something he didn't quite understand yet. But then, just as quickly, his mask slipped back into place. "Let's get this over with," Rowan said, his voice low and firm. Emery's stomach twisted painfully. She nodded stiffly and stood, gripping Theo's small hand in hers. Rowan walked ahead of them, every step measured, precise. He was a man used to control, to certainty, to knowing exactly what was his and what wasn't. And right now, Emery could tell that not knowing the truth was driving him insane. The nurse led them into a private testing room, where a doctor in a white coat greeted them with professional politeness. "Thank you all for coming," he said, flipping through a clipboard. "This will be quick and painless. Mr. Holt, you'll provide a cheek swab first, and then we'll collect one from young Theo." Emery's grip on Theo's hand tightened. Rowan gave a short, sharp nod, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt as if he were preparing for a fight. He sat down in the chair, his posture tense, unreadable, and took the swab from the doctor without a word. Emery tried not to watch as Rowan ran the cotton swab along the inside of his cheek, his movements controlled, precise. He didn't hesitate. Didn't second-guess. And then, his gaze lifted to hers. Emery's breath caught. Because there was something undeniably familiar about the way he looked at her. A flash of memory, a darkened hotel bar, a stranger's intense gaze across the room, a night she thought she'd never remember clearly. Oh, God! Was it possible? Was it really him? Rowan handed the swab back to the doctor and stood, his towering presence impossible to ignore. "Your turn, kid," he said. Theo grinned. "Okay." Emery watched, her pulse hammering, as the doctor gently swabbed Theo's cheek. She wanted to stop this. Wanted to snatch Theo up, run, disappear before the results could confirm what she was beginning to fear. But it was too late. The test was done. And now, all they could do was wait. Rowan didn't speak as they stepped out of the testing room. He didn't acknowledge the doctor's assurances that the results would be processed quickly. He didn't look at anyone but Emery. "How long?" he demanded. The doctor checked his clipboard. "A few hours." Rowan nodded once, curtly. "Send them to my office as soon as they're ready." The doctor nodded. "Of course, Mr. Holt." And then, Rowan turned back to Emery. His jaw was tight, his expression controlled. But his eyes, his piercing green eyes, were burning into hers. "You know the truth, don't you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Emery's breath hitched. "I." Rowan took a step closer. "You're afraid of what I'm going to find out," he murmured, softer now, but no less intense. "That means you already know the answer." Emery's heart pounded. She couldn't lie. Not when he was looking at her like he could already see straight through her. But before she could speak, Theo tugged on Rowan's sleeve. Rowan looked down, his body tensing at the unexpected touch. "Mr. Holt?" Theo asked, his voice small. Rowan blinked. "Yeah." Theo tilted his head. "If you're my daddy, does that mean you have to tuck me in at bedtime?" Emery's breath caught in her throat. And for the first time since she had met Rowan Holt, he looked completely speechless. But the scariest part? He didn't say no. The elevator ride back to Sterling Enterprises was suffocating. Emery stood with Theo in the corner of the sleek, steel-lined space, trying to breathe through the pressure closing in around her chest. Every second that ticked by brought her closer to the moment of truth, the moment when Rowan Holt would receive the DNA test results. The moment that could change everything. Rowan stood across from her, his broad shoulders tense, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had barely spoken since leaving the clinic, but his silence wasn't comforting, it was dangerous. Because Rowan wasn't a man who let things go. He wasn't a man who ignored the signs right in front of him. And right now, those signs were pointing straight at the possibility that he was Theo's father. Theo, of course, was blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. The little boy leaned against Emery's leg, staring up at Rowan with open curiosity. "Mr. Holt, do you have a puppy?" Rowan's sharp green eyes flickered down to him, momentarily startled. "What?" "A puppy," Theo repeated matter-of-factly. "Or a kitty. Or maybe a fish. Mommy says I can't have a puppy because our apartment is too small. But if you have a big house, do you have one?" Emery's face flushed. "Theo, sweetie, Mr. Holt is busy." Rowan ignored her. "No pets," he said shortly. Theo frowned. "Why not?" Rowan hesitated. Emery didn't think she had ever seen Rowan Holt hesitate before. Finally, he muttered, "Never thought about it." Theo gasped like it was the most tragic thing he had ever heard. "You never thought about puppies?" A ghost of amusement flickered in Rowan's eyes, but it was gone before Emery could be sure she saw it. "I've been busy." Theo wrinkled his nose. "Too busy for puppies?" Rowan's jaw ticked. "Yes." Theo sighed heavily. "That's sad." Emery swallowed the laugh that nearly escaped her lips. It was ridiculous how unfazed Theo was by one of the most intimidating men in the city. He wasn't scared of Rowan Holt, if anything, he was trying to figure him out. And the strangest part? Rowan was letting him. The elevator doors slid open, releasing them from the unbearable tension, and Emery practically dragged Theo out, determined to get back to her desk and avoid Rowan at all costs until the results came in. But she barely made it 2 steps before Rowan's deep voice cut through the air. "Come to my office." Emery's stomach twisted. She turned slowly, clutching Theo's tiny hand in hers. What? Rowan was already striding toward his private office, expecting her to follow. Mr. Holt, she started, flustered, I really need to get back to. He stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and raised an eyebrow. Emery shut her mouth. No one argued with Rowan Holt. Not if they wanted to keep their jobs. She exhaled shakily, adjusting Theo's coat before leading him toward the massive glass-walled office at the end of the hall. Her heart pounded with every step. This was it. No escape. No pretending this wasn't happening. Rowan was going to get the answers he wanted, and she had no idea what that meant for her and Theo. Inside Rowan's office, Theo immediately wandered toward the large leather couch, flopping down like he owned the place. Emery cringed, trying to gather herself as Rowan closed the door behind them. She had been inside this office once before, delivering documents when she first started at Sterling Enterprises, but now, standing here alone with him, it felt entirely different. The space was as impeccable as the man himself. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, casting shadows across the sleek dark wood floors. A minimalist glass desk sat at the center of the room, next to a small bar stocked with liquor Emery knew probably cost more than her rent. Rowan leaned against the desk, arms crossed. He watched her too closely, his piercing gaze making it impossible to breathe. We need to talk, he said finally. Emery's fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. About what, exactly? His expression didn't change. About what happens when the test confirms what we both already suspect. Her stomach clenched. You don't know that. His gaze hardened. I'm not an idiot, Emery. Her breath hitched. Theo looked too much like him. The same green eyes. The same dark hair. The same way he tilted his head when he was thinking too hard about something. Rowan had already put the pieces together. And now, he was waiting for her to admit it. Emery sank onto the couch beside Theo, keeping her son close, trying to ignore the weight of Rowan's stare. She needed to stay calm. To protect Theo from whatever was about to happen. I don't know what you expect me to say, she murmured. Rowan exhaled sharply. Start with the truth. Emery bit the inside of her cheek. And if I don't? Rowan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. Then I'll make sure you don't have a choice. Her pulse skipped violently. She had never been in a situation like this before. Never faced a man who could turn her entire world upside down with one decision. Theo yawned, completely oblivious to the silent war happening over his head. Rowan's gaze softened just slightly as he looked at him. And that terrified Emery more than anything else. Because Rowan Holt wasn't just demanding the truth. He was starting to care. And if the test results confirmed what he already suspected, there would be no going back. Emery had spent 3 years protecting Theo from the world, from powerful men like Rowan Holt, from anything that could take away the tiny, fragile life she had built for them. But now, that world had found them. And Rowan Holt wasn't going to let go. Not now. Not ever. The office was quiet. Too quiet. Emery sat stiffly on the leather couch in Rowan Holt's office, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could hear the distant murmur of phones ringing outside, the muffled chatter of employees moving about their day, completely unaware that her entire world was about to change forever. Theo, blissfully unaware of the tension filling the air, swung his little legs back and forth, his eyes fixed on the skyline through the massive glass windows. Rowan, on the other hand, hadn't moved from his place behind the sleek glass desk. His sharp green eyes were locked on her, unwavering, waiting. Emery knew what he wanted. The truth. And soon, he was going to get it, whether she wanted him to or not. She gripped her hands together tightly, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She had spent 3 years hiding. 3 years keeping Theo safe, making sure no one, especially not a man like Rowan Holt, could come into their lives and turn everything upside down. And yet, here they were. She needed to say something. Anything. But before she could open her mouth, the phone on Rowan's desk rang. Rowan didn't look away from her. He reached for the phone, his expression unreadable, and pressed a button. Yes. His assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. Mr. Holt, the test results are in. I have the file ready for you. Emery's stomach plummeted. She gripped Theo's tiny hand without realizing it, as if she could hold on to what little control she had left. There was a beat of silence before Rowan spoke. Bring them in. Emery couldn't breathe. The door opened, and a sharply dressed woman stepped inside, carrying a thin manila folder. Emery felt like she was going to be sick. It was just a piece of paper. Just words on a page. But those words had the power to rip apart everything she had built. The assistant set the file down on Rowan's desk and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind her. And then, silence. A thick, unbearable silence that wrapped around them like a noose. Rowan didn't touch the folder right away. He just stared at it. As if he already knew what it said. As if the confirmation was nothing more than a formality. Theo, still unaware of what was happening, turned to him with bright eyes. What's in there? Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached for the file, his fingers steady, his movements deliberate. Emery's entire body locked up as he flipped it open. And then. She saw it. His entire face changed. His normally controlled, unreadable expression flickered, just for a second. A fraction of a second. But it was enough. Emery knew. Rowan Holt was Theo's father. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart slamming against her ribs, wishing, praying, that she could take it all back. That she could erase this moment from existence. Because once the truth was out, there was no hiding anymore. No pretending. Rowan inhaled slowly. Deeply. And then, finally, he lifted his gaze. You knew, he said, his voice calm. Too calm. Emery's throat tightened. I wasn't sure, she whispered. It wasn't a lie. Not really. She had never let herself fully believe it. Had never let herself think too hard about the man from that night, the stranger who had made her feel safe for the first time in years, only to disappear before morning. She had told herself that it didn't matter. That the father of her child was just a nameless memory. But now. Now, that nameless memory was standing in front of her, a real, powerful, undeniable force. Rowan's eyes flashed. You expect me to believe that? Emery opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because no matter what she said, no matter how much she tried to explain, the truth was undeniable. Theo was his son. Rowan closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, studying her. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were anything but. He was calculating. Emery had seen him in meetings before, had watched him tear through contracts, dismantle competitors, shatter businesses with a single decision. And now, he was looking at her the same way. Like she was something to figure out. Something to control. Theo yawned beside her, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Mommy, I'm hungry. Emery grasped onto the distraction like a lifeline. I should get him home, she said quickly, standing up and pulling Theo to his feet. We've already taken up too much of your time, and I. You're not leaving, Rowan interrupted smoothly. Emery's breath hitched. Rowan stood, his broad frame towering over her. Sit down. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to stand her ground. Rowan, please, let's just talk about this later. No, he cut in. We're talking about it now. Her heart pounded painfully. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, like one wrong move would send her plummeting. Rowan turned to Theo, his expression less harsh now, but no less serious. You hungry, kid? Theo blinked up at him, then nodded eagerly. Yes. Rowan turned back to her. Good. We'll eat. And then we'll talk. Emery's throat was dry. Talk about what? Rowan's lips pressed into a thin line. About what happens next. A chill ran through her body. Because she already knew what he was going to say. She had seen it in his eyes the second he read the results. Rowan Holt wasn't the type of man who let things slip through his fingers. And now, he knew he had a son. A son he had never known existed. A son he wasn't going to walk away from. Her fingers tightened around Theo's hand. Rowan, she whispered. Please, don't do this. His green eyes darkened. You think I'm going to find out I have a son and just walk away? Emery's pulse skipped violently. Because she knew what was coming. She could feel it, crackling in the air between them. Rowan Holt wasn't going to let her leave this office and disappear again. This wasn't just her life anymore. It was Theo's life too. And Rowan? Rowan was about to claim it. Emery hadn't stopped shaking since she left Rowan's office. Her mind was racing, her body felt unsteady, and her heart ached with the crushing weight of what had just happened. Rowan knew the truth now. There was no escaping it, no turning back. And the look in his eyes, the sharp determination, the unwavering certainty, told her that he wasn't about to just let her walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. She had barely made it back to her desk before her phone buzzed. Rowan Holt, my driver will pick you and Theo up at 7 p.m. Don't be late. She stared at the message, bile rising in her throat. So that was it. No questions. No discussion. Just an order. Rowan Holt had found out he had a son, and now he expected her to fall in line, just like everyone else in his world did. She wanted to ignore him. She wanted to grab Theo and run. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Theo. And whether she liked it or not, Rowan was his father. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, Emery was a nervous wreck. She stood outside her apartment building, Theo's small hand wrapped in hers, as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver, dressed in an expensive black suit, stepped out and opened the door without a word. Emery hesitated. This felt too much like walking into a trap. She had spent 3 years carefully building a safe, simple life for her son. And now, in less than a day, everything had changed. Theo, on the other hand, was thrilled. Mommy. This car is so cool, he whispered loudly, his little fingers gripping the edge of the door as he peered inside. Emery forced a tight smile. Yeah, baby. It is. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage and climbed in, pulling Theo into the seat beside her. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing them inside. And with that, they were on their way to Rowan Holt's world. Emery had seen wealth before. She had worked in finance long enough to witness luxury up close, to hear stories about the kind of life people like Rowan Holt lived. But nothing had prepared her for this. The car pulled up to an exclusive high-rise in the heart of Manhattan, a building so sleek and modern it looked like it belonged in a movie. The entrance was lined with uniformed doormen, and the lobby was filled with polished marble, towering chandeliers, and quiet sophistication. Rowan was waiting for them in the penthouse. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth and silent, but Emery's nerves were anything but. She clenched Theo's hand, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. This was too much. Too overwhelming. She should have never agreed to this. But then the elevator doors slid open, and all her thoughts disappeared. Rowan's penthouse was breathtaking. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, revealing a panoramic view of the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. The open floor plan stretched out before them, filled with minimalist, modern decor, all clean lines, neutral tones, and quiet elegance. A fireplace flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow across the room. Theo gasped in amazement. "Mommy! Look at all the lights," he squealed, his little hands pressing against the window. Rowan stood near the large dining table, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to make him look relaxed yet powerful. His green eyes flickered toward Theo, then back to Emery. "You're late," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something unreadable. Emery lifted her chin. "Your driver picked us up exactly on time." Rowan arched an eyebrow. "Then I suppose you took your time getting out of the car." Her jaw tightened. "Forgive me for hesitating before walking into the lion's den." Something flickered in his eyes, but he didn't respond to her jab. Instead, he glanced at Theo, who was still pressed against the window, completely captivated by the view. Rowan's expression softened, just slightly. "I ordered dinner," he said, turning back to Emery. "You should eat." She swallowed hard. "Why are we here, Rowan?" He didn't blink. "Because I'm not letting you keep my son from me." The words sent a shockwave through her body. She clenched her fists. "I never kept him from you." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Then why am I just finding out about him now?" Emery's throat burned. "Because you left before I could find out I was pregnant." His eyes darkened. "You didn't look for me." She flinched. Because it was true. She hadn't searched for him. She hadn't tried to track him down. She had assumed it didn't matter. That whoever he wasn't meant to be part of their lives. And now. Now he was standing in front of her, looking at her like he wasn't going to let this go. Like he was already laying claim to a life she had built without him. Theo finally turned away from the window, completely oblivious to the tension between them. "Mr. Holt," he said, his voice bright and curious. Rowan's head tilted slightly. "Yeah." Theo's little brow furrowed. "If you're my daddy, does that mean we live here now?" Emery's heart stopped beating. Rowan's lips parted slightly, like he hadn't expected the question. Then, slowly, his gaze drifted back to Emery. Something dark and determined settled in his expression. "Yes," he said. Emery's entire body went cold. "No," she said sharply, stepping between them. "Absolutely not." Rowan didn't flinch. "You think I'm going to find out I have a son and let him live in that tiny apartment you can barely afford?" Emery's chest tightened painfully. "I provide for him just fine." Rowan's gaze was unwavering. Unforgiving. "Not anymore." Her breath caught. She should have expected this. Should have known that Rowan Holt wasn't the type of man to take a back seat in anything, especially not something that belonged to him. And now. Now, he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let them walk away. He wasn't going to let her walk away. And that terrified her more than anything else. Emery felt like the walls of Rowan's penthouse were closing in on her. She stood frozen in the middle of the lavish living room, her hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her pulse hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat. Across from her, Rowan Holt stood with his usual calm intensity, his sharp green eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, unrelenting. His words still rang in her ears. "Yes, you live here now." Like it was a decision already made. Like he had simply declared it, and that was that. Like she had no choice in the matter. Emery forced herself to breathe, even as the weight of those words settled deep into her chest. She needed to be careful, needed to think this through, because Rowan wasn't just some man. He was a billionaire. A powerful one. A man who was used to getting what he wanted at any cost. And right now? He had decided he wanted his son. Theo, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between the two adults, stood beside Rowan, staring up at him with wide, fascinated eyes. "Mommy, does that mean I get my own room here?" he asked excitedly. Emery's breath hitched. She had to stop this. Now. "No," she said firmly, stepping forward and gently pulling Theo away from Rowan's towering frame. "We are not staying here." Rowan's expression didn't change, but something sharp and unreadable flickered in his gaze. "You think I'm going to let my son continue living in that apartment?" he asked smoothly, his voice too calm, too controlled. Emery bristled. "That apartment is our home." His jaw tightened slightly. "It's not enough." Her stomach twisted violently. "Excuse me." Rowan took a slow step closer, his presence too overwhelming, too consuming. "I've seen where you live, Emery. I know how much you make. You've done everything you can for him, I can see that. But let's not pretend that it's enough." Emery's fingernails dug into her palms. She hated this. Hated that he was looking at her like she had failed. Like she wasn't doing everything in her power to give Theo the best life she could. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare stand there and act like you care when you weren't even around for the first 3 years of his life." Rowan's expression didn't waver. But the air between them shifted. Dangerous. Heavy. Like the quiet before a storm. "You didn't give me the chance," he said, his voice so low and measured that it sent a chill down her spine. Emery swallowed hard. "You left. You didn't look for me." The words slammed into her, sharp and cutting. She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him that she hadn't had a name, a number, anything to go on. That she had assumed he was just some stranger, some fleeting moment in a past she had tried to forget. But the way he was looking at her, like he was peeling her apart piece by piece, made it impossible to say anything at all. "Maybe I didn't," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think you'd care." A muscle in Rowan's jaw ticked. "You were wrong," he said simply. And somehow, that was worse. Because now, Rowan knew. And Rowan cared. And Rowan didn't let things go. Ever. Rowan exhaled slowly, like he was forcing himself to steady his temper. Then, he walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering city lights for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not going to take him away from you," he said finally. Emery's breath hitched. That had been her biggest fear. That Rowan, with all his money, power, and influence, would go to war to take Theo from her. She had no doubt that he had the means to do it. But as much as Rowan was cold and ruthless, as much as he operated with absolute control, she didn't see cruelty in his eyes. Not when he looked at Theo. Not when he spoke about being a father. Still, she didn't trust him. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice wary. Rowan turned back to her, his gaze calculating, measured. "I want to be in his life," he said. Her chest tightened. "That doesn't mean we move in with you," she argued. Rowan tilted his head slightly. "Doesn't it?" Emery stiffened. "No. We can work something out, something reasonable. But we are not just packing up our lives and moving into your penthouse like it's some kind of solution." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You think I'm going to settle for weekends and holidays?" She swallowed. "Most fathers do," she shot back. "I'm not most fathers." The words hung between them, thick with undeniable truth. And deep down, Emery knew he was right. Rowan Holt wasn't a man who settled. He wasn't a man who did anything halfway. And now, he had made up his mind. He wanted to be in Theo's life. And Rowan Holt always got what he wanted. Theo yawned, rubbing his sleepy eyes as he leaned against the couch. "Mommy, I'm tired." Emery's heart clenched. This had already been too much for him. He needed to go home, to sleep in his own bed, in the only home he had ever known. She looked at Rowan, standing there like a king surveying his kingdom, like he already had this all figured out. Like he wasn't going to let them go. And maybe she was too exhausted to fight anymore. She let out a slow breath. "We're going home," she said quietly. Rowan's gaze darkened. "You'll be back." Her spine stiffened. "Don't tell me what I'll do." He took a step closer, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I'm not telling you. I'm telling him." Emery followed his gaze, to Theo, already half asleep, his tiny hand curled in her sweater. She swallowed hard, her throat aching. Because deep down, she knew. Rowan was right. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The city stretched out in front of Emery, glowing with the golden shimmer of lights from 100 skyscrapers. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her small apartment, watching the streets below, lost in thought. The weight of the past 24 hours had settled over her like a lead blanket. Rowan knew now. There was no pretending, no hiding, no going back to the quiet life she had spent the last 3 years building for Theo. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed them to her lips, the conversation from earlier looping in her mind like a relentless echo. "You'll be back." She had left Rowan's penthouse feeling like she had escaped something far too big for her to control, but deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't escaped anything. She had only delayed the inevitable. A small sigh stirred behind her, pulling her attention back to reality. Theo was curled up on the couch, fast asleep, his tiny fists tucked under his chin. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm raging around him. Emery's heart ached. She had always known she would have to answer for her choices one day. She had just never expected the reckoning to come in the form of Rowan Holt. The knock on the door was quiet, yet firm. Emery's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to ask who it was. She already knew. Her hands felt like ice as she smoothed down her sweater, willing her heartbeat to slow. For a brief, fleeting second, she considered not answering. Ignoring it. Pretending she wasn't home. But she knew Rowan wouldn't leave. He would stand outside all night if he had to. With a deep breath, she crossed the small apartment, her footsteps nearly silent against the old wooden floor. She unlocked the door, pulling it open just enough to see him. And there he was. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, completely unfazed, completely unreadable. The light from the flickering overhead fixture cast sharp shadows over his face, making his features seem even more chiseled, more intense. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the tension in his forearms. He looked unstoppable. Like a man who had already decided how this was going to go. Emery's pulse skipped. "Rowan," she said quietly. His green eyes flickered over her face, unreadable. "You didn't answer your phone." Her stomach twisted. She had seen his missed calls. 3 of them. And she had ignored every single one. "I needed time to think," she admitted. Rowan exhaled slowly, as if trying to hold back his impatience. "And have you?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." And the answer she had found terrified her. She stepped back slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "You can't just show up here." Rowan's gaze didn't waver. "Why not?" She hesitated, her mind racing for an answer that would make him understand, make him let this go. But he wasn't going to let this go. He had made up his mind. She could see it in his eyes. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. This wasn't supposed to happen." His jaw ticked. "And yet, here we are." Emery swallowed. You don't know what this means. I know exactly what it means, he said, his voice low, steady. It means I have a son. And it means he's not growing up without me. Her chest tightened painfully. She had fought so hard to build something stable for Theo. And now, Rowan had come in and upended everything in less than a day. You can't just decide that, she murmured. His expression didn't change. You think I don't have a right to be in his life? The question was so calm, so matter-of-fact, but there was an edge beneath it. A warning. Emery closed her eyes briefly, trying to push back the fear rising inside her. That was just it. Rowan wasn't asking for a place in Theo's life. He was claiming it. And the scariest part? She didn't know how to stop him. The door clicked softly behind them as Emery let Rowan inside, stepping out of the way as he entered the small space. The contrast was stark. His presence in her tiny apartment was too much, too big, too overwhelming. She wasn't sure if it was because of who he was or because of what he represented now. His gaze flickered briefly over the room, taking in the small couch, the mismatched furniture, the soft glow of a cheap lamp in the corner. There was no judgment in his eyes, but Emery still felt exposed. Like he was seeing too much. And then, his gaze landed on Theo. Emery held her breath. Theo was still asleep, his chest rising and falling softly, his little fingers curled into a fist. Rowan's face changed. It was subtle. Barely there. But for the first time since this entire mess had started, Emery saw something in him that she hadn't expected. Not possession. Not power. Something softer. Something like awe. Her heart clenched. She should have been relieved that he cared. Instead, it made her terrified. Because if Rowan cared, if he really cared, she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to keep him out. Rowan inhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He looks like me, he murmured. Emery's stomach flipped. She didn't respond. Because what was there to say? Of course Theo looked like him. That was exactly what had started this entire mess. Rowan let out a quiet exhale, then turned back to her. His expression was calm again. But she knew better. This was a man who had already decided the outcome. This changes everything, he said. Emery's throat tightened. I know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside, the soft breathing of the child who had brought them back together. And then, Rowan took a slow, measured step forward. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. But no less certain. We'll figure it out, he said. Emery's breath hitched. You don't get to just decide that, she whispered. His green eyes met hers, unshakable. I do now, he murmured. And deep down, she knew he was right. Rowan Holt wasn't just going to be in Theo's life. He was going to be in hers, too. Whether she was ready for it or not.